The endosymbiotic theory is a theory that explains some of the origins of the organelles that we have. So with that, the organelles that we specifically think about when we're talking about the endosymbiotic theory is the mitochondria and then also the chloroplast. And I'll explain a little later why those two in particular are thought to have arisen by this particular theory. But since this is a theory, that means that there is a lot of evidence to support this. So over time, way back in evolutionary history, it is thought that organelles arose by this endosymbiosis, and that did then later give rise to our eukaryotic cells as well. So if we were to take the word endosymbiosis and just break the word down, we can really get an idea of the theory right there. Because what this is saying, endo is inside, and symbiotic, this is kind of a cooperative relationship. So it's inside cooperative relationship, and that does describe what we're going to be looking at. So if we were to draw this, and if you'll just bear with the drawings a little bit, what is thought to have happened is that at some point in evolutionary history, you had a large prokaryotic cell and a small prokaryotic cell. So we had these two cells here, and what happened is the larger cell consumed the smaller one. And the way that it consumed it is it engulfed it. So if we look at that, we had this larger cell that's going to wrap itself around the smaller cell so that it can eat it or engulf it. And then after that happens, if we take it a step further, now we've got this little cell which we engulfed, but because of the way that it was engulfed, if you can just visualize this over here, kind of closing up around that smaller prokaryotic cell, you do end up with the small cell that's on the inside with this extra layer of membrane around the outside of it. So with that, if we just label this, this is the large cell. And then the very inside would be the small cell. And if this was just a normal feeding, we would expect that the smaller cell would get digested and it would benefit the large cell because it provided a food source. But for some reason, in this particular example or in this theory, the small cell is not digested. So because it's not digested, okay, it remains on the inside of the large cell. And so that's the inside part. But since it wasn't digested, another thing that it does is these two cells are going to start to work together in some way. So they're going to start providing mutual benefits for each other. So in other words, they are going to form a symbiotic relationship. And what a symbiotic relationship is this is a mutually beneficial relationship. So in other words, the two cells are cooperating with each other. And over time, this developed into something that the two cells could not live without. So in other words, they became dependent on each other. So the large cell was dependent on whatever the smaller cell was providing, and the smaller cell was dependent on the larger cell. So that became kind of a single organism in itself. So you had this now larger cell that had this smaller compartment inside of it. That's the basis of the theory. It is thought that this probably happened several times during evolutionary history. And one of the events, or a few of the events, gave rise to what we now know as mitochondria. And then there were other events that gave rise to what we know of as chloroplast. And these two, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, are thought to have really resulted from different types of smaller bacteria being engulfed. So if we now shift a little bit and we talk about what's the evidence for this, why do we think that mitochondria and chloroplast came from this particular theory? Why did they originate as small cells that were engulfed by this larger cell? So there are several pieces of evidence that give kind of some credence to this theory. So first of all, one thing that we often look at and we cite as this is the fact that the mitochondria, and I'm just going to abbreviate it as MT, and the chloroplast, and that's going to be my abbreviation for that, they both contain DNA. And so these are locations other than the nucleus where we actually do find some DNA inside a eukaryotic cell. So they have their own DNA. And in addition to that, the DNA that they do contain is very reminiscent of what we find in a typical prokaryotic cell today. So the DNA in a prokaryotic cell, if you'll recall, is going to be circular DNA. And it is circular DNA that we find inside the mitochondria and then also inside the chloroplast. So that's one of the lines of evidence that is often pointed to or cited when we start talking about this theory. Another thing about them is that the mitochondria and the chloroplast contain their own ribosomes. So what this means is that they've got their own DNA, they've got their own ribosomes, they are going to be able to manufacture some of their own proteins. They are certainly going to get some of their proteins from outside of the mitochondria and the chloroplast, but they do manufacture quite a few of them inside. So that is another evidence that's often pointed to. A third piece of evidence is the fact that both of these are what we call semi-autonomous. And what this semi-autonomous refers to is the fact that these two organelles, their replication is independent from the rest of the cell. So when the cell needs more mitochondria, the mitochondria just replicate themselves. Or when the chloroplast, when we need more of them, the chloroplasts replicate themselves. They don't have to coordinate that with the overall cell reproduction process, which we'll later learn is called mitosis. And then the other piece of evidence, which is one that we've kind of looked at a little bit already when we drew out the theory, is the fact that both of these, the mitochondria and the chloroplast, they are surrounded by multiple membranes. And those multiple membranes are thought to have come from the fact that when that whole engulfing process took place, you did end up with this extra layer of membrane around that smaller prokaryotic cell. So again, if we just drew that picture that we had on the previous slide again, we had this situation here where in this picture, we are seeing two membranes around that smallest compartment that we have. Both the mitochondria and the chloroplast have these multiple membranes around them. Specifically, the mitochondria actually has two, and the chloroplast has another one there. So the chloroplast has three membranes that are around the outside or found inside of the chloroplast itself. So again, the endosymbiotic theory, it is really believed to have given rise to what we now know of as the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And there's a lot of evidence that does confirm that this is very likely to have been the case.